Good morning and welcome to the first Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee meeting of 2020. The first item on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 5 and 6 in private. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We now come to item 2 on the agenda, which is protected trust deeds. And today we have Richard Dennis, the Accountant and Bankruptcy and Agency Chief Executive, Kelly Donohoe, who is the Head of Debt Arrangement Scheme and Trust Deeds, and Stacey Dunn, who is the Trust Deed Team Leader. So welcome to all three of you. And I understand, Mr. Dennis, you have a brief opening statement to make on this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Convener. Thank you for the committee for finding the time to take our views on this topic and giving us a chance to talk to you about protected trust deeds. And if it's not too late, Happy New Year to you and the committee members as well. You'll be aware we've been wrestling with the issues around protected trust deeds since long before I became the accountant in bankruptcy 5 years ago. You may have seen from our written submission that some of the concerns here are pretty much the same as the ones the Cullen Committee looked into between 1907 and 1910. So there's some pretty intractable decisions here about getting the balance right, and there have been many attempts that have been made to address them over the years. Front and centre, I would urge the committee and we, as we think about our policy, to make sure the interests of the person in unsustainable debt are kept right at the forefront of our minds. I think there are two main issues around this. Firstly, whether there's any evidence to suggest that those taking out protected trust deeds don't really need debt relief. And that goes to the heart of quite a lot of the material that the committee have had submitted to them. And secondly, when there's any evidence that those people granting trust deeds would be better off in an alternative debt solution. Stakeholders don't agree on the answers to those questions. You'll have seen that from the submissions you've had. I have quite a lot of sympathy for the difficulties credit unions and other small creditors have experienced when those they've lent money to sign a trust deed. But the fundamental question remains whether or not the individual signing that trust deed needed debt relief when they signed the trust deed, and whether they should be given a genuinely fresh start through the process. In thinking about what, if any, changes might be needed, and you'll know we've consulted twice on sets of proposals, there have been two issues very much in the centre of our minds. The first is that a trust deed is in essence a voluntary agreement between a debtor and their creditors. Assuming creditors are content with what the debtor has proposed, why should we, as a regulator, have a role to get involved? It's a voluntary agreement. If both sides are happy, why should the state or the regulator take an interest? So the question then is, do we know that creditors genuinely are content? Can we demonstrate that? The proposals we put forward to change the voting system were intended to make that crystal clear, as well at the same time as giving us far more information about the nature of debts held in trust deeds and which creditors were voting for or against. And again, that's one of the topics you'll have seen reflected in the material stakeholders sent to you. Second, I think we have a concern that the current arrangements don't really pass the test of what the person in the street might think about as being fair. So proposals where someone makes 48 monthly payments, but 40 of those simply cover the costs of the process, seem quite hard to defend to the man in the street. Much the same thing happens in many bankruptcies. You all know that in 4 out of 5 bankruptcies, creditors get nothing. Is it different when debt relief is seen to be administered by a private firm, perceived to be driven by a profit motive, or is it the same? One of the things we looked at raising the minimum debt level in trustees for was precisely to address that type of issue. The committee is also very aware of the need to look at all the debt solutions together. And I know that's something you've pressed on us. We do take forward our proposals on individual debt solutions with that in mind, and you'll have heard the Minister now committed to the Scottish Government doing a more generic review. And I wanted to just mention a couple of points about the interrelationship between trust deeds and the rest of the system. So the recent changes the committee kindly agreed to on the debt arrangement scheme are intended, at least in part, to alter the dynamics of the relationship between trust deeds and DAS. But it will be some time before we know whether or not we've achieved that. It takes anything between 4 or 5 years for us to be able to assess the impact of the changes we actually made to the system. but also draw to the committee's attention that from 2013 to 2015, people in trust deeds made 4 years of contributions, but they only made 3 years in bankruptcies. In 2015, that period was standardised to 4 years in both, and it's notable that the relative trend between those two products completely changed when that adjustment was made. And that brings us to one of the fundamental questions, a question ICAS have raised with the committee. How far is it for the debtor, the individual, to choose which is the right product for them, or how far should that be determined for them by their circumstances? Lots of questions in the evidence that you've received, and we'll do our best to answer them. I've brought along folk who deal with the trustees from a day-to-day basis, so hopefully we can give you some more sort of lived experience beyond the theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. You comment on you give the example of the 40 months, 48 months, so 40 months paying for the process, 8 months paying off the debt. And you talked about the question and the possibility of raising the amount that had to be involved for protected trust deed to be used as. And I mean, what's the alternative? I suppose the question in those sorts of circumstances. The example that you chose, the 48 month with 40 months being spent just for the cost of the process rather than paying the debt.
Well, one of the key questions here is how long is it appropriate for someone to make a contribution towards their debts? So if we are looking at trust deeds that are just over the minimum debt threshold, so a trustee for say £5,001, and we know the average contribution, if you're looking at the lowest 10% of cases, is about £110. So for 48 monthly payments, you're paying £4,800 in contributions over your 4 years. Your debt was £5,000. So you still need debt relief if you can't actually make the payments. Would it be fair for us to say, actually, you should make contributions for another 6 months through a debt arrangement scheme and pay off your debt in full? Or would people like that be better off in a bankruptcy? So there are some potential alternatives, but bankruptcy and protected trustees are different products with different implications. So that's why we need to test out the questions about how long is it fair to ask an individual to make a contribution.
So I suppose to a certain extent also whether the debtor wishes to go down the bankruptcy route or not. They may not wish to for whatever reason, and they may choose the other route, which might be more expensive in one way of looking at it.
Yes, at the moment it is debtor's choice. We have already said if your debt will be fully paid off within the 48 monthly payments, you're not entitled to go for a trust deed. That's already there in regulations.
But you would, I mean, you referred to sort of the perception would be that the way it's set up is not necessarily fair. Is that, I suppose, what are the parameters or the considerations when looking at whether or not the sort of setup you refer to, the 48-month scenario you posit, is fair or not?
I think in essence it comes down to a political judgment. Whatever debt relief product you put in place will have a cost, and that cost needs to be covered. As I say, most bankruptcies, so if you abolish protected trust deeds, you might see a large number of those people coming into debtor applications for bankruptcy. It's not obvious that that would generate any higher dividends for creditors. It's a question of balance and how far you want to come back to that fundamental choice. Is it the debtor's choice based on the implications for them, or how far do you need to take into account the creditor's interests, and how far do you need to take into account wider public interests in running the cost of the process and the implications that has for the cost of credit for the rest of us?
And so, is the balance the right balance, the way it is set up at the minute?
My personal feeling, and I have the great advantage in not only being a Chief Executive fully accountable to the Scottish Government, but also being an independent officer of the court, so I'm allowed to have my personal feelings, is that for trustees right at the bottom of the minimum debt level, the balance isn't quite right. I do think it's quite hard to defend a product where almost all the debtor's payments are consumed by fees, where in other options they could have been used to settle the debt. So I think there, although there is inevitably a cost to the process, where I don't think we have the balance between the debtor and the creditor interest quite right, and I think the burden on creditors for those particular trust deeds is not necessarily easy to defend.
Right, thank you. Follow up briefly from Richard Lyle, and then we'll come to Gordon MacDonald.
You mentioned, Mr. Dennis, you mentioned debtor's choice. In my experience, basically people who are in debt or owe money tend to hide it, forget about it, stick the letters in the bin or somewhere else, bury their head in the sand, and then eventually they come across someone who gives them the panacea of their, I'm going to solve your problem. Is that not why people enter into these agreements? Because finally, at the end of the situation, maybe after many months of a company trying to deal with them, that they then fall into the trap of going to someone else who charges these exorbitant fees. Is that not the case?
Well, I think that comes back to the key question about whether or not there's any evidence that individuals are being advised to take out solutions that are not necessarily in their best interest. There is a lot in the regulation that requires firms selling or offering different debt products to make sure the client is fully advised of all their options. And we can talk about exactly the details of that. If the committee want, we can set out the requirements in legislation for you. It is the role of the registered professional bodies to go in and check that process is happening through random sampling of a significant volume of cases. I believe you're having evidence from representatives of the RPBs who can set out that process and the changes they've made, particularly for the big volume providers. You will have seen, again in the evidence given to you, that the level of complaints, the number of people who will let us know that they think they have been badly advised, is remarkably low. So there's a lot of anecdote about individual cases that look very cut and dried. We haven't necessarily had the chance to look at those particular cases unless a complaint has been raised with us. There isn't a hard body of evidence to suggest that large numbers of people are being put into inappropriate products. Again, you'll have noticed that we have consulted on giving us a generic power to refuse protection in cases where we think the protected trust deed is not the right solution. Stakeholders, I think, quite rightly raise the concern that that leaves the individual at risk because they will have gone through a process for some months leading towards getting them debt relief, and then suddenly we might say, actually, we don't think this is the right product for you.
To sort this, and if the convener let me, just one more question in regards to this point. To sort this, should we not maybe introduce a set fee to ensure that the debt, £5,000, £6,000, whatever, that £5,000 of that debt goes to the creditor and £1,000 goes to the trusted administrator, rather than this switched round situation where, as Gordon MacDonald made out, that less than a third is paid off. Should we not? Is that not one way to fix it? That set fee be put in rather than, and again, I have to say that in my experience, people want to have a solution at the end of a big problem and are willing to listen to anybody to solve that problem.
You could move to a situation of a minimum dividend, and that has been consulted on some years ago. What are you going to do about all those individuals who don't have sufficient surplus income to provide that minimum dividend? What is going to happen to the folk needing debt relief when they can't find someone who is willing to administer a protected trust deed on their behalf because the requirement to pay a minimum dividend means there's no guarantee their fees and charges won't be covered. As I say, the evidence suggests that if those people instead put forward a debtor application for bankruptcy, creditors will not receive anything further.
Perhaps we'll now come to Gordon MacDonald.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. Just to set the scene before I ask about the supervisory roles of the AIB, etc., your latest bulletin on your website suggested that there had been a 33% increase in the number of trustees registered in 2018-19. Is there any reason for that substantial increase in that 1 year? It went from 5,958 in 2017-18 to 7,915 in 2018-19.
Yes, that's right, and I would expect trustee numbers to be up again this year. I think the committee will be very aware of the statistics about the general level of consumer debt in society. Our expectation, if you look at total consumer borrowing, it actually sort of precedes people coming into statutory debt products by about 2 years. There's about a 2-year lag between changes in total consumer borrowing and people coming to statutory debt solutions. All the evidence suggests there are far more people in Scotland who need debt relief than are accessing it. There are, I think some estimates, something like 10 times the people in problem debt compared to the people actually coming forward to taking advice. And as all that begins to bite as we move on through the economic cycle, you would expect more people to be coming forward for solutions. There's been a follow-on question. Why are more people ending up in trust deeds and increasingly the debt arrangement scheme than there are going through the bankruptcy process? And again, in the evidence that has been set out for you, I think there are a number of advantages for the individuals who are going down the trust deed route, particularly if they have equity to protect or if they're in certain types of employment. And there's also capacity constraints, which I know have been raised with the committee. So I think anecdotally, if you want to make an appointment to see a money advisor with your local Citizens Advice Bureau, you may be facing a month to 6 weeks wait before they can find a time to talk to you. One of these companies will probably be able to talk to you direct immediately. So you can see that in terms of debtor choice, as has been said, once you reach that crisis point, you need to take action. You want to take action now.
In terms of number of complaints, again, off your website, 2010-11 there was 2 complaints, and a number of years it was 0, average of 2 per year for the last 8 years. And in 2018-19 there was 23 complaints about the PTD process. What was the reason for the substantial jump?
My recollection, and I will correct this if I've got it wrong, is a significant number of those complaints were raised by individual credit unions, and you'll have seen in the evidence provided for the committee that protected trust deeds are a very live and increasing issue for the credit unions, but I will check and confirm on that. 23 complaints out of a total caseload of 30,000 is not...
I accept it, but when you look at the actual trend of number of complaints, it's a substantial increase when it's an average of 2 per year for the last 8 years.
That's certainly true.
So my question I was going to ask was, the AIB has the power to audit the accounts of a PTD trustee. How many cases do you audit a year?
Yep. So we compiled the data over the last 3 years, and we have completed 66 audits over the last 3 years.
Out of what, 8,000 registered in a year?
Per year. So there's 2 different ways an audit can be completed. A creditor or a debtor can request it, or AIB, if we believe there may be an issue in a case, we will request the audit for the case.
So 22 that you do in an average year, what is the lead reason? Is it the creditor, the debtor, or AIB's concerns?
Primarily AIB concerns.
And
So it may
what's the
be-
nature of those concerns?
We complete supervision checks on each of the cases, and if there is anything picked up that we don't believe should be there, or if there's any reason for concern that we find in annual reports or proposals, anything like that, any reason at all, we will ask for case files to come in, and we will complete a full audit of the case to check that everything adds up, everything there's that should be there. There's invoices to match any payments that have gone out. So things like that will ensure that the case files are as it should be.
Do you publish the concerns that you find when you do these audits? The reason for asking is that I had a look at the Insolvency Practitioners Association website, and in a 2-month period they issued 5 warnings. Failure to address a significant voting omission that materially affected outcome of a creditor's meeting. Fees were miscalculated and remuneration was drawn in excess of what was allowable. Fees drawn from estate funds at a time when he did not have approval to do so. Remuneration more than the time costs incurred without approval. Inappropriately banked third-party funds in the insolvency services account. Is that reasons that you've picked up when you've carried out those audits?
Some of them may be. When we complete the audit, we'll issue a determination. So for any fees that have been included in the cases that we don't believe should be there or cannot be invoiced, we will then determine a set fee based on what evidence there is and what we believe is correct. What then happens is, if we believe there is an issue with the files or the invoices, or if we just believe that it needs to be escalated, we will then refer the issue to the RPB. And as you say, if they uphold and if there is a warning issued, then that is published.
And, you know, what is the action that you guys can take that stops practices like this happening? If somebody, say a large organisation, is regularly defaulting on one of these issues that I've raised out?
We can restrict the fees that they've been able to take in the individual case. What we can do as well, if we complete an audit and we think this is a wider issue, if we think this might be an issue across more than a singular case, what we could then do is ask for further files. And as I say, if the evidence isn't there, or if it's not correct, the fee will be restricted, and we will not allow where it's not appropriate. In that case, when it comes to further action across the board, that's then passed to the RPB.
And is there anything that would assist the AIB in investigating these audits or the types of defaults that these organisations carry out that isn't in law at the moment that would assist to get best practice effectively?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think that would probably be more for the RPB.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Convener. We've received evidence, as you may have seen from previous sessions, that customers have been subject to pressurised selling by lead generators who receive information about potentially people with problematic debts on the internet and other sources, and that's without independent advice. What steps can the AIB take to avoid and prevent lead generators mis-selling protected trust deeds to these consumers or clients?
To be honest, not a great deal. When we find websites that are offering misleading advertising, we will challenge them and get them taken down. We will often report them to the Advertising Standards Agency or the Financial Conduct Authority. And I think over the last year we've had something like 50 websites taken down. But as you'll know, as soon as you take one down, another one is up. It's really important, I think, to realise that the individual insolvency practitioner, if they acquire a lead from a lead generator, becomes fully responsible for all that information. It's the insolvency practitioner's job to make sure that the client has had the correct device and the correct choice. So regardless of the fact the lead generator might have taken you through a process and said, right, the right answer for you is a trust deed, it will be the IP's responsibility to make sure that the client has had genuinely impartial advice, they understand their options, they understand the choice, and that they still want to go ahead with the trust deed. And again, if you look at some of the material the RPBs will, I think, offer, they will go in and they will listen to conversations between clients and the IP firm. They will make sure that's all happened. So although the lead generator might have given a very strong steer, and that doesn't necessarily result in what you might call mis-selling. I mean, I know there are concerns as to the extent to which these products are advertised, but again, as has been mentioned in the evidence you have in front of you, raising people's awareness of these products in itself can be valuable without necessarily meaning that they're ending up in the wrong product. You may also have seen that the RPBs and the Insolvency Service and the FCA are moving towards a situation where particularly the volume providers are now expected to ensure that any lead generator they use is FCA regulated and licensed, which should largely help resolve that issue. And you'll have seen some of the social media platforms like Google have said they will no longer accept advertising except from FCA authorised companies. So steps are being taken, whether that means there won't be misleading Facebook pop-ups. If you've started Googling debt, you'll be getting these saying 90% debt write-off government-backed scheme, and we do what we can about those, but as you know, it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, it strikes me that there's quite a number of loopholes in that approach in terms of adverts can, if they're not allowed on Google, they can find their way on Facebook and other social media. And you mentioned that insolvency practitioners are expected to only deal with generators who are FCA regulated. Is that a hard requirement, or is that sort of best practice?
At present, my understanding is it's best practice. So rather like when I issue guidance, firms are required to take it into account. In other words, if they were challenged, they'd have to demonstrate good reasons why they'd set that aside. The registered professional body has set out very clearly they expect the IPs to be operating that particular business model. And again, if they had concerns about that, that is one of the things they will pursue in their regular discussions. Coming back to the difference between advertising, I think it's important to say that the lead generator cannot of themselves get people into a trust deed. They generate a lead that says this particular individual might be appropriate for a trust deed, and they'll pass that on. But it is the IP and the firms themselves who are then responsible for ensuring that the client knows exactly what they're getting themselves into, and that product is the right solution for them.
Okay, but we've heard evidence that more than a quarter of all protected trust deeds fail, and when they do fail, the client finds themselves in a worse position than they started, and presumably part of that failure rate is down to mis-selling. I know there will be other reasons, but presumably mis-selling is part of that. I mean, it sounds to me that the regulatory requirements are a bit loose, given that it's guidance best practice and that other forms of internet advertising and mis-selling can take place. Would you agree that the regulations in this area need to be tightened up?
I think it's difficult. I suspect I might say this quite a few times this morning. The essence of this is a voluntary agreement between an individual and their creditors. Now, clearly, we want the individual to be appropriately protected and to know what they're doing. Every time we have looked, ever since the Cullen Committee, every time this has been looked at, there's been a bit more regulation added. The Cullen Committee originally started with auditing fees. We've gone on to make requirements about the fee model, the cram-down requirements, the voting arrangements. So every time we've done this, we've put more and more in place. And that partly drives up the cost, it partly reduces flexibility. Failure rates is interesting. I'm not sure all of those who've supplied evidence to you are using the same definition of failure rates. And we have done some work, and if you'll have seen the additional statistics we published subsequent to our submission to the committee on our website, that's been done to give our best guess at what the real position is with failure rates. And we think This is looking only at those protected trust deeds granted in 2013-14, because that's the most recent year where we expect the vast majority of trust deeds to have concluded, so we can look. The real failure rate is about 15%. Now, by failure rate there, we are talking about individuals whose trust deed is finished and who are not discharged of their debt. You've had evidence very recently in from Carrington Dean, who you will know are the largest provider, about failure rates, and they would say the biggest issue behind failure rates is individuals stopping making their payments and not getting in contact with the company. It's hard to see what alternative you can put in place unless the individual is prepared to re-engage with the process. So, I think there are a lot of issues around failure rates. We haven't quite got to the bottom of a proper understanding of what's going on there. And I'd be hesitant to reach the conclusion that failure rates are necessarily a result of mis-selling. These are inevitably people who are in financial difficulty, in financial hardship. All of us face unexpected shocks and life changes. There may be very good reasons why individuals cannot maintain the obligations they've signed up to for a period of 4 years.
Okay, thanks very much. Just a final question on regulation. Given some of the mis-selling and I guess bad practice you sometimes see in practice, are you in regular contact with the regulators, FCA and the Insolvency Service to feed this back? And what recommendations have you made to the regulators in terms of changes to the regulations?
We are in very regular contact with the Insolvency Service, and you'll have seen again in our submission that England and Wales have a very similar product, the individual voluntary arrangement. It's not a direct parallel protected trustees, but it tends to be the same firms offering them. We tend to see the same business models, the same processes, and we discuss concerns. One issue we've been trying to work on directly is the issue around disbursements and outlays. You'll have seen we have proposed rolling those all up into the upfront fixed fee, because post-2013, when we introduced the fixed fee, we saw those outlays significantly increase when we thought there were a priori expectations to see them decrease with modern IT and etc. And we thought moving to a single upfront fixed fee model would give greater clarity. The Insolvency Service have been discussing with the RPBs different ways of addressing the same issue, and we're in regular contact to discuss that. Apart from that, we have focused on the bits of the regulatory framework that are pretty much under our control. We are in regular discussion with the SCA. We report concerns to them, particularly around misleading advertising and lead generators. I sit on the FCA's anti-phoenixing task force, which is about dealing with recycling money advisors and financial consultants, etc. We work together as a family of regulators. I'm fairly satisfied that's working as well as it might.
Thank you.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to follow on from Dean Lockhart there, I mean, like many people, I suspect I've been Googling for protected trust deeds in advance of this session. And I've been bombarded, absolutely bombarded with offers to wipe debt out from rather nebulous, unnamed bodies that are difficult to identify and so forth. My understanding is that the FCA actually has no locus over marketing and advertising on protected trust deeds. Is that correct? It is in the evidence we received.
It's a tricky one to give a black and white yes or no to, unfortunately, Mr. Beattie.
None of these adverts say that the bodies concerned are FCA monitored or anything like that.
You need FCA permissions before you can engage in what they define as debt counselling. Or
Debt counselling?
not necessarily.
Is marketing debt counselling?
Not necessarily.
So you would perhaps agree that there's a bit of a gap there, and especially if these stringers are doing introductions again, according to the evidence, at possibly £1,000 a time, then there is a certain amount of pressure to actually follow through on that, because companies are not going to give £1,000 here and there to people that are introducing without some reasonable certainty they're going to follow that through.
Yes, I agree companies are unlikely to buy leads unless some of those leads turn into products. There's also...
Percentage of these leads turn into...
I have no information on that.
No.
And indeed, the statistics available on what's going on in the lead generation market are virtually non-existent. Similarly, we know virtually nothing about the extent of non-statutory debt management plans, which are vaguely similar. So I
appear unique in a financial product. There's a whole area here that's virtually unregulated, marketing and advertising for it. And as I say, I've seen the examples myself coming forward. I mean, it is shocking in the way that they're worded and the way that they're promoted.
and you'll be aware that the Advertising Standards Authority similarly has a role here. I agree there are lots of regulators who need to work together to crack this, and the evidence you've had presented.
Well, advertising standards people only get involved if there's a complaint. They don't proactively trawl through adverts and try and find ones that are dodgy.
We will raise complaints with the Advertising Standards Agency when we come across these.
How many complaints did you raise last year?
As I say, my recollection, and again I'll come back to the committee, is that we had about 50 websites taken down last year. 50.
I had more than that coming at me, offering me debts. Anyway, that's a different thing. Perhaps we can move on to fees. You do audits from time to time on fees, and the majority of these audits are initiated by yourselves rather than by third-party complaints. Are there any systemic problems that you see in fees? Is there a recurring problem?
I mean, this partly comes back to the fundamental philosophical question here, in that the fees are made clear to creditors at the start of the process. Creditors have a vote on whether or not the offer put in front of them is acceptable. If we see the basic nature of this product as being a voluntary arrangement between an individual and their creditors, and creditors have approved it, why would we then get involved? Now, we might get involved if we saw those fees dramatically increasing systemically, if we saw outlays or disbursements that we thought were unjustified, but we'd do that in a reactive sense rather than a proactive sense, because creditors get this information, and to the extent it's a private voluntary arrangement between them and the individual, there isn't necessarily a role for us to police that and to say the creditors that although they've accepted something, we don't think it's in their best interest.
So it's pretty much open on the fee side as to what people can charge, providing the poor sod that's got the debt signs off.
Well, no, the debtor's contribution is determined through the Common Financial Tool, which we've discussed many times at this committee. So the debtor's contribution has to be their full surplus income as determined by that. And if that isn't sufficient to cover the costs of the process, they will struggle to get someone to run a trust deed on their behalf.
Let me give you a non-philosophical example. And this is from one of my constituents, and I've got permission from the family to talk about it. I had a lady who had a debt of £20,000, repaid £6,000, had the misfortune, unfortunately, to die before the end of the protected trust deed period. And that seems to have triggered a huge amount of additional fees. And I'll give you some examples. Statutory, bear in mind, on paper, the payments are now down to she's now down to £14,000 debt. Statutory interest, £7,000. Trustee fee, £2,500. Trustee realisation fee contributions, £1,270. Trustee realisation fee lump sum, £3,000. Legal fees, £3,000. Accountants in bankruptcy advertising fee, accountant in bankruptcy registration fee, accountant in bankruptcy supervision fee, software fees, courier fees, bank charges. I mean, now that debt, which was paid down to 14,000, is back up at almost 28,000. The only asset is the equity in the house, which the family, of course, had hoped to inherit. That's gone. It may be legal, but is it fair and is it moral?
It's very hard to comment on the specifics of an individual case, though if...
Comment on an individual case because you've got some hard figures there in front of you. I mean...
But if you will send us the details of that case, we will look into it and we will call the files in and we will do an audit on it.
But I'm just using this as an example of a protected trust deed that, to me, did not work.
So when the client took out that trust deed, they agreed to make their £6,000 worth of payments across the 4-year period, which had they reached the end of...
6,000 over the 4-year period. I'm saying that's
Right.
what they'd paid up to the point of death.
Right. And when that trust deed was advertised, the trustee that went to creditors would have said, our fees for administering this are the fixed fee you quoted, plus 25% of whatever we gather, and we will also have to meet the AIB's fees, which is a statutory requirement. So already creditors would have been aware that a significant share of that contributions would have been covering the administration costs. Now, whether the individual gets debt relief in that situation is them completing the terms of the trust deed they've signed. It's nothing to do with the contributions they make vis-à-vis the overall debts they started with. Now, I'm very sorry for the family in this situation. They're obviously in a very sad predicament because of this individual's death. We will look into the case. First, I mean, without...
The principle behind this is really important because this is clearly neither fair nor moral, however legal it might be. How do we prevent this happening?
Well, what a protected trust deed is designed to do is they're an individual who cannot pay their debts and they need debt relief. So an IP on their behalf makes an offer to their creditors. Their creditors accept that. If the individual meets the requirements of that trust deed, which will very largely now be to make their stream of payments over the agreed length of the trust deed, the individual will then be granted relief from their debts. So that's how it's supposed to work. There's nothing in that about guaranteed return to creditors. It's what creditors choose to accept when they vote, though you will have seen in the evidence that a lot of the large voting blocks, 10p in the pound, is what they require before they would vote in favour of a trust deed. The question is, can the individual afford to pay their debts? The answer is no. What then is it? How then do we pay for the costs of administering that debt relief? And for someone, you've seen the material on the average cost of administering these products. For someone who's able to afford to only make a contribution of £100 a month, there will be very little left for creditors. Should we say they are not allowed to access debt relief, or should we say that the public's purse somehow has to pay the cost of administering the process?
Answering the problem that we've got in front of us. I mean, we know what the rules are, and we're not saying that any of this is irregular, that it's illegal or anything like that. What we're saying is, have we put in place, should we be looking at this from the point of view of fairness both to the creditor and the debtor, because the amount of money that's being taken by these intermediaries is completely disproportionate. I mean, this is absolute banditry, to be honest. I mean, you have looked previously at consulting on options for reforming protected trust deeds, and I think nothing's been done because there's been a lack of consensus on this. Are you going to take any further action on options to reform?
In terms of
Be outraged at this sort of thing. It's not what's expected.
I mean, I think you've heard the Minister say, and the question of the regulatory framework is one for him and the Scottish Government rather than for me as the accountant in bankruptcy. We are very aware of the widespread stakeholder concerns here. We would not have consulted on options that we could put to the Minister if we didn't think there was something worth doing. We have twice put forward a package of proposals to stakeholders suggesting that these might be a way forward. We have yet to have a package we can bring to you and say, look, we've discussed these concerns with stakeholders. There is sufficient consensus for us to bring a package to you in the acceptance that will improve the situation.
Consensus as long as some of the parties are going to be able to pull in fees like this. Is there not a case now to legislate or change regulations, whatever it takes, even without consensus, because it's the right thing to do?
I think the Minister will be extremely interested to see the committee's recommendations on the way forward here. You have heard me talk about what I think might be the right answer at the start of this session. But I think the premise of your question is that there is some sort of super profiteering going on here, that firms and third parties are charging fees that cannot be justified. I have not seen hard evidence that shows that is the case. And I
Copy of this, but I mean, your average man in the street is shown this, £20,000, paid back 6,000, and you're still due about 28,000 because of the fees that have been piled on it. That's not fair. And fairness has to be at the basis of all legislation.
I entirely agree with you. There are particular circumstances in this individual case which we will look at. Had that trust deed been completed, then the individual would have benefited from debt relief. Now, their creditors might not necessarily have got a significantly larger share. What I'm not quite sure is at the root of your question that the extent that's been used up in fees is unjustified? In other words, was the process much cheaper than the contribution and fees that's been taken? And I'm sure that's one of the things the committee will want to pursue when you've got some of these folk in front of you in future sessions. This is one of the things creditors, among others, will look at very closely. You will know that the large voting blocks are content with fixed fees of a certain level because that is their perception of what one of these products costs to administer. It's quite hard to second guess that.
One last question, just, if change is to be initiated, does it come through yourself?
It can come from us, it can come from you, it can come from the Minister, it can come from outside stakeholders, and we've looked very closely at all the proposals that you've had suggested to you in the evidence.
So if I might just clarify, I mean, I think your point is if, for example, in the case put to you by Mr. Beattie, you don't have the detail of that, so it's difficult for you to comment on that specific case. If there are rules, sometimes these rules won't work fairly in individual cases or appear not to work fairly. You've indicated you would look at that case if he gives you the detail of that. Does that mean that you would exercise some sort of power or authority to address an issue if there is a case, or do you even have the power to do that where the fees are excessive in the circumstances?
We have a general power to issue a direction to a trustee on how a protected trustee should be administered.
So you could do that if in a case the particular fees and the circumstances were utterly disproportionate, if I can put it that way.
Yes, as I believe Stacey mentioned, we can call in a case file, we can check to see that there are appropriate invoices for everything that's been charged to that case. So yes, and if there isn't evidence to support particular fees that have been charged to a case, they can be struck out.
But that would have to be raised with you if you haven't picked it up through the processes you've referred to.
Yes.
So is that a weakness in the system, in the sense that if you're dealing with, I can't recall, was it 60 cases over 3 years that you had actually done an audit on out of several thousands every year, is it a question of you not having possibly the number of people necessary to look at these cases closely enough to pick up on something like that, bearing in mind that debtors in these sorts of circumstances may just not know which way to turn, as it were, and therefore don't raise it specifically with you?
Well, I'll just say one last time. Essentially, the nature of the product is a voluntary agreement between a debtor and the creditors, and if both sides are content, then we would not necessarily get involved. If one party is not content, there are plenty of channels by which they could be directed to raise a complaint in the right area. Now, we will largely only act on a reactive basis in our regulatory function. The RPBs will not. They go in, for the big firms now, they go in, I think, quarterly. They also have some live monitoring of their caseloads, so they can pick up trends by having direct access to their IT systems. They will listen to a significant scale, random selection of cases. They will audit random files, and they do that, I'm pretty sure now, on a quarterly basis, and you'll have them in front of you. You can ask them for the details of that. So there are, again, you'll have seen the evidence from the RPBs claiming that this sector is more tightly regulated than any comparable because of the role of the different regulators. So I wouldn't want you to get the opinion that out of the 30,000 cases, only 60 are looked at a year. There are significantly more, but it's done by different parts of the regulatory framework.
I think it was 60 are audited, so obviously they've been looked at and somehow been raised and therefore audited, as I understood it. And I mean, I suppose, obviously I don't know the particular circumstances of the case Mr. Beattie's raised, but your point was that if creditors, for example, accept 10 pence in the pound, if there's £14,000 of debt or amount outstanding, that would reflect 140,000 of debt in the first place. So even with fees, the debtor is still getting a substantial discount.
My understanding of that case, the debtor comes in and they sign as the trustees, they convey their assets, and they agree to make a regular monthly payment to the IP, who passes it on to their creditors once they've dealt with trusts. Once creditors have accepted that, there is no relationship between the level of debt and the contribution made. If you meet the terms of your trust, increasingly these days, if you make your 48 monthly payments, then you are discharged from all your debts, regardless of the size of contribution you've made to them.
But also, of course, if there are fixed fees, these are not necessarily related to the work actually being carried out. In administering the protected trust deed.
Well, yes and no. Again, there's no easy answer. I mean, there's certain processes that IPs have to go through on all trustees, regardless of the size. So we would expect them to do an annual review of a client's financial circumstances to make sure the contribution was still affordable and sustainable, at least annually, and that needs to be done on all of them. If you look at some of the stats that we've provided, there's a fascinating lack of relationship between the overall fees and the amount of debt that's being dealt with. So, for example, if you look at trust deeds with an average debt of less than £6,000 being dealt with in 4 years, the average administrative cost is £3,900. If you look at trust deeds with an average debt being paid off in 4 years of over £10,000, the average fee is £5,400. So a pretty small increase in fee for more than a doubling of the debt, which is why the concern is about trust deeds between the sort of 5,000 to 7,000 level of debt, where the same sort of contribution might pay off those debts in full through the debt arrangement scheme.
Right. I'll now come to questions from the Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just to follow briefly on that issue that was raised there by Colin Beattie, do you think there are, do you think that debtors are aware of the potential that they face after a situation like that arises, where effectively there's a default on the payment? And I want to come to credit unions as well in this regard too, where they feel particularly vulnerable when there's a failure. So in that case there, without getting into the specifics of it, Mr Dennis, do you think a family, a debtor, is going to be aware that that's the consequence of a failed protected trust deed arrangement? Or do you think more needs to be done to make sure that they are aware, and so that a proper correct choice might be made?
In terms of the family, we find many examples of where the family are completely aware that an individual is in a statutory debt product. I wouldn't necessarily feel it was our responsibility to override the individual's decision about whether they choose to share that with their family or not. In terms of the individual, I might ask Kelly to run through, I think it's the Section 167 requirements that the IP has to go through with the debtor before they can sign off the deed.
It's just as part of our case checks that we do. Every trust deed application that comes in to be protected is checked over, and part of that check is the IP needs to have a declaration signed in terms of the Bankruptcy Act that the individual is aware of what they are signing, and that all debt options have been discussed with the client, and that usually tends to take the form of 1 or 2 pages with I have sat down and discussed, and we have discussed DAS, we've discussed bankruptcy, and I have explained the consequences of going into a trust deed with the client, and they've fully understood that, and the client has to sign that declaration to say that they've understood it. Now the question for us would be how content and how far would we go to ensure that that client is aware of it, or whether they've just said, as you know, people in debt are quite often vulnerable, frantic, they need something done to help now. Do they fully understand that and sign it, or do they actually take it in and ask questions on it? So I guess the question is, how far do we go? We see the forms coming in and as part of the statutory process that the client has read and understood. I declare I have read and understood these terms and conditions, and it's signed. So is there a stage further to that you believe we should be doing?
I get that and I understand that, but what I'm really asking is, if a person was to say, what happens if I default on this, or my parent defaults on this through tragic circumstances, what am I facing then? I mean, reading all the documents in advance of it is one thing, but when a tragic circumstance like that, or any other circumstances where there's a default on the arrangement that's been made, occurs, do you think people are fully aware of the consequences of something like that?
Certainly hope so, but again, how do we measure that and check it, other than having a declaration that the IP has said we've gone through it, we've discussed it, and the person signed it?
Okay.
I draw your attention to some of the evidence from customer surveys that the firms themselves have provided you, and particularly that most of the firms will say only a minority of the folk they advise are ending up in trust deeds, suggesting that they are being given the full range of alternatives.
Yeah, but I don't know the case, and it's silly of me to comment, but I would be prepared to make a guess that no family would be aware of the extent of the additional debt that's mounted on top of the arrangement after circumstances like that have occurred, and be signing up quite happily to that.
Certainly the case that we see lots of examples of families who are unaware of the circumstances of a deceased or other individual.
Okay. I wonder if I could just take you back to your opening remarks when you were talking about the credit unions, and I should declare to the committee that I'm a member of East Ayrshire Credit Union as well. You said you had some sympathy, Mr Dennis, for the credit unions, and I took some notes of what you were saying there, that sometimes there's a discussion about whether they actually whether they needed a protected trust deed, or should they simply start afresh. That's what I'd written down from what you'd said. What did you mean by that, and why do you think the credit unions are saying that they are a bit more vulnerable to this process than perhaps others are?
As you'll know, credit unions are limited in the APR. They can charge to, I think it's 3.6% a month, and they are lending to at least partly a vulnerable client base. So you might expect them both to be more exposed to the potential for bad debt, and less able to cover the costs of bad debt because they can't offset it by charging higher APR to their clients. So for an individual who signs a trust deed, the credit union might instantly lose 80% of their loan. So the question is, could the individual have afforded to pay back their debts? If the answer is no, then the credit union have lost their money anyway. If the answer is yes, then the individual didn't need debt relief. And that's why I say the fundamental issue here is, do we think people here are being able to access trust deeds who don't actually need debt relief? And there isn't the evidence to suggest that in my understanding. It's one of the issues I think the committee will want to probe with your other witnesses.
So do you think, what would you say that if the credit unions were excluded from the PTD process, what would be the implications of that actually happening?
That comes back to the second of my opening remarks, is does the individual need a fresh start? If you're in unsustainable debt, you can't afford to pay those debts. Should you be given a clean slate? Or should the credit union debt be able to survive? If the credit union debt, student loans, for example, survive. Court fines survive. How about council tax? Should that survive? Where do you draw the line? If you believe the individual needs a completely fresh start, and the emphasis has increasingly been through all of sort of bankruptcy and debt relief product on giving that individual an absolutely clean slate, then you can't have debts that survive.
Who decides whether the clean slate can be offered? Who makes that?
It's a political question for you folk.
But do the credit unions have any scope or influence there to offer a clean slate solution rather than a PTD solution to a client?
Effectively, you're asking, could the credit union write off somebody's debts? Now, it is, and again, I think you'll have representatives of the money advice sector in front of you. It strikes me, I would expect the situation to be occurring when a canny money advisor who knows individual creditors will say, look, my client needs debt relief. They are going to go into a statutory debt product, or I can give you 15p in the pound now if you just write down their debt. What would you do? So I'm sure that kind of thing happens. We just never know about it. It's just debt adjusting.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you.
Richard Lyle.
Yes, again, I have to declare I previously worked as a debt collection manager for the Royal Bank of Scotland. And basically I came across, and I've said this before, I came across situations where people were misinformed. You kept using a word in the last number of minutes, debt relief. There's no debt relief if the person enters an unfair trust deed that's charging exorbitant fees, a 50% fee. Now, if someone needs a loan or gets a loan and they don't pay it, generally the bank, building society or company that's given the loan sells it on to another company who buys it for maybe 50 pence to the pound, who then sells it on to another company who maybe buys it 25 pence to the pound. And eventually it gets to a point where people are continually getting bombarded with letters. And as I said earlier, people hide and forget about it. But suddenly somebody offers them the panacea of a protected trustee and says this will remove all your situations and everything in the garden of Rosie, pay me £50 a month. But what they don't tell them is that maybe £25 or £30 or whatever, that 50 quid is getting taken in fees. And the point, that astonishing case that my colleague Colin Beattie put across is totally outrageous. So we've also got a significant area of concern where protected trustees fail. The trustees discharged from their duties to creditors, but the debtors not discharged from their debts. In practice, that means that the debtor becomes responsible for paying their debts in full again. So it's a never-ending circle. So would you not agree that this whole situation or product, or whatever you want to call it, needs to be looked at, resolved, and somehow some situation or solution found for people who do, in most cases, want to pay their debts eventually, and who can make an arrangement with a company. But the only thing is the company then, a couple of months or a year or so later, sends them a letter and says, can you give me your income and expenditure, fill out this form, and you know, your £100 a month, can you make it, or £50 a month, can you make it £100 or £150 a month, you know, to try and get the debt down lower. Do you really, honestly, can you really sit there, Mr Dennis, and defend protected trust deeds in all the questions and evidence you've given this morning? Do you really defend someone charging exorbitant fees to people who really are in a situation they really need help?
I can say a couple of things in response to that. Firstly, there are 30,000 people getting debt relief through protected trust deeds at the moment. On the assumption that they need debt relief, if we were to do away with protected trust deeds, we'd need to find an alternative option for those folk. Secondly, you used the word exorbitant fees. Firstly, the individual signing the trust deed is not any better or worse off, regardless of what the fees are. The creditors would lose out from exorbitant fees. The individual pays their full surplus income as calculated by the Common Financial Tool, regardless of what the level of fees and charges is over the agreed period. So it's the creditors who lose out from exorbitant fees if such things exist. It's not the individual.
But what really does someone who operates a protected trust deed do? Okay, they sit down and they supposedly tell them, the debtor, what's going to happen. And then they sit back and the money rolls in. That's what happens. What do they do? What really do they do? They get someone to sign a bit of paper, they contact the creditor, they basically sit and the money rolls in. And then they occasionally invoice, or they send out an invoice, or they send the creditor some money to keep them sweet. Really, what is somebody who operates, you know, and we will get these people in, and I'll certainly be asking them that, what really do they do to charge these exorbitant fees? Can you tell me?
I'm tempted to say I'll leave that one to the individuals concerned, who will be out, and you'll understand why. I mean, one of the questions here is, if folk are really charging exorbitant fees, if they are super profiteering, why aren't other firms coming into the market and undercutting them by a couple of %?
Comments that Colin Beattie made that a lot of firms want to come into the market, but they may be hide. Anyway, I'll ask the question that I was supposed to ask you. A big concern for money advice sector is the consequences of failed protected trust deeds. But it appears that insolvency practitioners do not take a consistent approach. Some end their PTBs because the debtor can no longer afford the repayments, while others only end them when there's been non-cooperation. Do you have a view on any correct approach in regard to this comment?
Yes, and our guidance makes clear that when an individual can no longer maintain their payment because of a change of circumstances, that should not result in their failure of their trust deed. So our guidance makes that plain. And I have to say, I know the evidence raised with the committee suggests this is a major concern. We don't have individuals raise that with us as an issue. We do have powers which we could potentially use to address individual situations if individuals were raising that with us.
My questions by saying I can understand your comments in regard to all this, but really, can you see a better way, or can any of your staff give us a pointer of a better way to help people who, as I always try to do, help people who were in debt to try and get out of debt, and basically, is there a better way?
We've consulted on a number of proposals which we wouldn't have consulted on had we not thought they were the right thing to do. You will know that the Scottish Government Ministers are committed to a generic review of the whole area. I think there's an interesting question raised by ICAS about whether there's room for another product in the stable to just address consumer debt. So a sort of protected trustee light, which you wouldn't necessarily need an insolvency practitioner for, which might therefore make it much cheaper.
Thank you.
But presumably that would then be operated by someone who's not regulated as a professional insolvency practitioner would be.
They would still be regulated by the FCA and potentially by us, depending on how it was designed.
All right. Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just got a few questions here. In your opening remarks, you talked about bankruptcy and protected trust deeds now being both 4 years, and this led to a change. What change was that?
Years immediately preceding that change, the number of bankruptcies was growing relative to the number of trust deeds. Immediately afterwards, the number of trust deeds started to accelerate and the number of bankruptcies started to decline. Okay,
and you're confident that's related to the change, or?
No, I just raise it as a potential issue.
Okay, that's fine.
Because if it's the case that that 1 year of additional contributions was driving debtor choice, that raises the issue of how far it should be the individual's choice between the products.
Okay, thanks. You also said that if someone's awarded bankruptcy, the creditor will see no more money than if in a protected trust deed. I think you said words to that effect. Could you just
It's statistically true that bankruptcies generate lower dividends on average than trust deeds.
Okay. That's fine, thanks. You also made a repeated reference, correctly in my view, about the fact that these are voluntary arrangements. Of course, that argument can only go so far because we have put in place a statutory framework. Hence, the public is taking an interest in this. So it's not, I don't think, legitimate. You're probably not arguing this, but it's probably not legitimate just to say we leave people to make voluntary agreements. We have decided that we want some statutory underpinning to that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. We compel non-assenting creditors to accept the terms of a trust deed unless they vote against in sufficient numbers.
Yes, that's right. I just want to draw your attention to the evidence of the Working Party of the Centre of Scots Law, Aberdeen. I included Donna Mackenzie, who has written a book on this topic. I think you refer to, you summarise, in fact, some of the history of this, some of the law around that in your Annex A itself. They've drawn our attention to recent litigation, which they publish a draft analysis of in their response. And they point out the fact that if a party grants a trust deed, it becomes effective even if it is not clear that it will ultimately become a protected trust deed, and will remain effective even if it does not become a protected trust deed, which may become problematic for the debtor, not least because the debtor may then be unable to seek alternative solutions. And they say it's also unclear whether a clause would be valid and effective if it provided that the trust deed was revocable if it did not become a protected trust deed. Do you have any sort of views on that problem, potential problem?
Our understanding is it's a potential problem. It isn't necessarily a real-world one.
That's fine. That's useful. We've had evidence from the Citizens Advice Bureau, and they, following up on this question of failure, and I understand there's, what do we mean by failure, etc. But it does seem to me, they point out the severe consequences of failing, where individuals end up back at stage one because the people will lose all the money that's paid into the protected trust deed. They're no further forward with their debts. They're abandoned by the trustees who've taken their fees, and then have to enter another debt solution, which extends the period under which they're under financial stress. In terms of how one designs debt solutions, that's out of step with the other two debt solutions, is it not? In terms of the risk that the debtor is taking on, that they might find themselves in circumstances where they are back at square one. Surely that fundamentally offends the notion of what debt relief is about, whereby obviously at the beginning the creditor is taking a risk, lending money, obviously, and there's questions about that and the levels of consumer debt in society. But once that relationship has been established and the debtor genuinely gets into difficulties, surely the point of debt solutions is to obviously try and get some money back from creditors, but is also to give debtors a clear route out of their debt. So if there's the risk that the whole thing might fail and they're back at square one, that doesn't seem consistent with what I understand to be the principles that would underpin why we have debt relief in the first place.
First of all, I'll ask Kelly to talk about what happens if a debt arrangement scheme fails.
Much the same, actually, as in a trust deed. If a DAS fails, obviously it's another voluntary arrangement between a debtor and their creditors, again underpinned by statute, but no insolvency. So in a DAS, dividends to creditors are higher in DAS because more money is paid. Obviously it's 78 pence in the pound now that goes back to creditors. So if a client has been paying a DAS, the longer a client's been paying a DAS, if the DAS falls or is revoked during the period of the DPP, the overall amount due to the creditors will invariably be less than it would be if a trust deed has failed, because the fees are significantly less in a DAS DPP. Interest and charges can be applied by the creditors if a DAS is revoked, but generally speaking, if a DAS is revoked, the amount due to creditors is much less for the client than it would be if a trust deed was to fail.
I'm not sure I entirely understand the point you're making there. That in a DAS, though, you wouldn't be back at square one. You would have paid some of your debts.
Correct. You would have paid some of your debt, but the client will still have some debt there that they would need to seek advice on how to.
No, I understand that. I understand that. But understand that absolutely. But the idea that in a protected trust deed you'd be literally back at square one, owing all that money, seems to me to offend the idea of debt relief, which is once you enter it, as you go through month by month, you should, as I understand it, the principle behind it, you should be paying down your debt so that even if it fails, you're in a relatively better position than when you started because you have paid some of your debt. The idea that a debt relief solution should be designed in such a way that if it fails, you're completely back to stage one and no account is taken of all the money you've paid, and you've got the side offence, as it were, moral offence, that most of the money's gone to, a trustee, seems to be wrong.
There are two issues at stake here. The first is you have reached an agreement with your creditors that they will write off your debt if you pay them 15p in the pound or whatever, and then you don't pay that. The second is the IP is administering this for you. If your first payments go to reducing your debt rather than covering the IP fees, why would the IP run the product?
That's an important point. I'm glad you raised that because that came out in the evidence. Again, life is relatively straightforward for IPs who are taking these on because they get their fee before the creditor gets any money. And there has been concern expressed, and we've heard some of the evidence today around marketing and stuff like that, that people are involved in protections are taking on protected trust deeds because they are a useful way of earning perfectly legitimate fees. But the fact that no money goes to the creditor before they get their fees seems to reduce the kind of due diligence that they would undertake as to whether, in fact, a debtor is able to enter this. And if it was a proportion, I mean, you mentioned figures of 3,000 with a 5,000 debt, 5,000 with a 10,000 debt, whatever. If that kind of proportion in any particular case was to be given to the trustee and the proportion to the creditor, then it would focus the mind, would it not, of the insolvency practitioner just that little bit more, that in fact this was the right solution for the debtor. So because they're taking on some risk that they will not actually get their fees.
Potentially, the risk is that to cover the cases in which they are not receiving their fees, their overall costs across the caseload have to go up. But yeah, you could specify a minimum dividend. You could specify that a fixed percentage of every payment has to go to the creditors, like is done in the debt arrangement scheme. That would be an option.
Okay. I mean, Consumer Advice Scotland provide a useful range of case studies in their appendix, which appear to suggest that consumers, debtors, are not really receiving impartial advice and entering into these schemes with a clear and open mind. They talk about a client who was initially turned to protected trust deed because of action being threatened for her student loan. She wasn't told that student loans couldn't be included. I mean, you'll have read this, I'm sure. And I'm just wondering whether there's any mechanism. I mean, you've already indicated in response to a case that Colin Beattie has given you some information. Obviously, you're not aware of the whole case. I mean, are some of these cases that come to Money Advice people, or indeed so insolvency in particular, Consumer Advice Scotland, I mean, and you sit down and do kind of case studies to try and detect what the real problems are in individual cases like this, and determine whether in fact there's more systemic problems there, or...
Yeah, if they were raised with us and with the RPB, we would look into the circumstances.
You say that because you said that before about people complaining, and I mean, my point to you is that people who are in debt and facing financial difficulties, probably the last thing on their mind would be complaining if a scheme wasn't delivering. I mean, that's the very, very last thing on their mind. So it's not reasonable, I would suggest, to rely on people coming to you or making complaints as a measure as to the satisfaction that debtors have with these schemes. I think those in positions, the accountant in bankruptcy, the regulated professional bodies, need to be a little bit more proactive and go out and looking at the real world experience of people in debt and what's going on. Just not rely. I mean, I'm not sure that you're suggesting you're totally relying on that. I know you're just giving us the facts, but I don't think that's a satisfactory measure of whether, in fact, these schemes are satisfactorily being implemented.
I mean, our role is largely reactive. As I hope I set out for the committee, the regulated professional bodies do go in on a quarterly basis and monitor a random sample of cases. So they will listen to the conversations between the client and the company to check that the client is being taken through the correct advice process.
Correct me then, the statutory basis under which you operate, are you telling me that you would have no powers to voluntarily and of your own initiation decide to do some level of investigation into, for example, the kind of issues that are raised in Appendix 1 of Consumer Advice Scotland's, Citizens Advice Scotland's evidence? You have no powers to do that, is that what you're saying?
No, we could.
You could.
Stacey's drawing to my attention some statistics. I'll tell her about the number of reviews we've undertaken as part of our supervisory function.
What we can do, I explained earlier the audit process. What we can do is a softer version of that, and it's called a review. What we do, and this is proactive on our part, this isn't reactive, we will pull in, depending on the trustee's caseload, 10% of their cases for a file review. And it's in those cases, things like, like the issues that you're talking about can sometimes be flagged up. Because at that stage we are seeing the full case file, so that's from the pre-advice through to the protection and anything that's gone on throughout the trust deed. So in those cases, we can flag up things like that. As Richard said, it is, with bigger issues, it is primarily reactive, with complaints and requests for audits and things like that.
Do a little bit of proactive stuff with
Yeah.
cases that have come, that protected trust deeds have been entered into. But the kind of cases that Citizens Advice Scotland are describing are often cases that never actually get to protected trust deeds because they shouldn't, but they're at risk of going there.
Yeah.
You know, so you could be proactive on that as well, couldn't you? I mean, just in the general course of your work, you could.
We couldn't necessarily, as we
Okay.
don't have any legislative powers until it's protected.
Okay, that's fine.
Which was difficult to say.
Clarify that.
What I was also saying, we have a stakeholder group called the Protected Trust Deeds Standing Committee, on which bodies like Citizens Advice and the firms are represented, and they would sit down and discuss trends emerging like this and concerns that have been raised.
Okay, and in your opening remarks, I think you said words to the effect that in looking at this whole area, we should be focused on the interests of the debtor. Is that an accurate reflection of what you said?
Yes.
Okay, and I think I would agree with that because, I mean, at the bottom of this are people who have money lending money to people who don't have money. And there's a fundamental power imbalance there, and there are laws and processes to protect the interests of people when they enter into obtaining debt in the first place. And then there are laws in place to protect the interests of debtors when they get into difficulties. So at all stages, really, the interests of the debtor need to be looked at a little bit more by public policy and legislation than the interests of creditors, just due to that power imbalance. And I'm wondering, I mean, in the context of another piece of legislation we've been looking at on the proposed Consumer Scotland body, I mean, it seems to me that there is some potential consumer harm in this. You talk about this being a voluntary arrangement. You talk about the fact that many debt reliefs are entered into voluntarily between debtors and creditors without going through any statutory scheme at all. But in all those cases, the vulnerable party in here is always the debtor. And what consumer protection do they have in terms of being the consumer of a product? You may not know the answer to that question. I'm just wondering if you do have a perspective.
In terms of the original loan or in terms of the debt product?
In terms of the debt product, now, I mean, put aside the original loan.
I think the answer would be around the various powers of the various different regulators to pursue and deliver redress for them in the event of something going wrong, and of the RPB's ability to fine and, in the final resort, revoke the licence of the practitioner.
Okay, well, maybe we'll explore that a little bit further. And finally, I just want to pick up on a question I think one of my colleagues was asking, Richard Lyle, I think it was, about consensus. It seems to me that I mean, as you helpfully point out, I should say, in your very, very helpful evidence in recounting the history of all this, which I always find useful. I mean, problems that have been around for a century are obviously problems that are not going to be easily fixable as others. But we've heard language around that there isn't a consensus. And I mean, this is not really a question for you, but I would just suggest that at the end of the day, these are matters that we as a Parliament and ministers and government should take responsibility for. And just because there's not consensus in what one might describe, I don't like the word, but within stakeholder groups, is not a licence for government and Parliament not deciding, well, fine, there's no consensus, but there's good reasons why there's no consensus, because you have, as we explored in the Common Financial Tool and elsewhere, you have two very divergent interests of debtors and creditors. So surely if there are problems emerging, we should, as Parliament and government, take responsibility for, in the absence of consensus, forging a way ahead. In other words, that shouldn't be an excuse for inaction.
I completely agree, and I would echo the Minister's welcome for the committee's willingness to grasp this particular thorny nettle.
The Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland's evidence about a potential further debt relief solution. Has any work at all been done over the past 5-10 years on whether we do need another one, or is that just an idea they're throwing up in the air?
I can't remember the time frame. My colleagues will maybe help me out on this. We did work on what we in the office call a PTD Lite. Along those lines, I think it was just before the 2013 consultation. Now, there was an intense period of reform across the entire suite of debt relief and debt management options that culminated in the 2013 PTD regulations and the 2014 Act, which at the time was designed to be getting the system fit for the 21st century. Unfortunately, the world changed at ever faster rate. As I said earlier, we need something like 4, 5, 6 years before we can genuinely tell the impact of one set of changes. The committee has cautioned us very strongly against making changes to individual debt products without the chance to kind of assess the whole piece. So we continue to work on it, we continue to strive on it, and we'll look forward to hearing the recommendations you come forward with.
Okay, thanks so much.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming in today, and I'll bring this session to a close at this stage. Thank you to our witnesses. And we'll now move to item 3 on the agenda, which is the Public Procurement, etc. Scotland Amendment EU Exit Amendment Number 2 Regulations 2019, which are made under the powers conferred on devolved authorities in the EU Withdrawal Act 2018. Under the protocol between the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, the committee is required to consider whether the procedure attached to the SSI is appropriate or should be changed. The instrument is subject to negative procedure. The Scottish ministers have suggested the instrument should be categorised as of low significance, as the amendments it makes are technical and do not amount to a policy change. Is the committee content that this SSI be subject to negative procedure? Yes. Thank you. We then move to item 4 on the agenda, which is subordinate legislation again, and the item under consideration is the Public Procurement, etc. Scotland Amendment EU Exit Amendment Number 2 Regulations 2019. These regulations are made to address retained EU law to enable it to operate effectively and other deficiencies arising from the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. Does any member have any substantive issues they wish to raise, or are they content that the instrument comes into force? Thank you. In that event, we are agreed, and I will now suspend the meeting and we move into private session.